Have you ever wondered what it takes to break a man who has everything? What happens when success becomes meaningless? When wealth can't buy back what matters most? And when the silence of loss drowns out everything you once believed in? This is the story of Richard Cole, a tech millionaire who lost more than his wife. He lost himself. And how sometimes the smallest voice really can sing the loudest truth. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, forgotten after giving everything to others, or wondered if your heart could ever heal from devastating loss, this story is for you. The marble floors of the Cole mansion in Bozeman, Montana, used to echo with laughter. Anna's voice would drift through the halls, sometimes humming, sometimes singing the melodies that lived in her heart, like butterflies waiting to take flight. Richard Cole built his empire on understanding the human mind. His mental health technology company had revolutionized how people accessed therapy, bringing hope to millions. Forbes called him the CEO with a heart. At 40, he had everything: a $50 million company, a beautiful home nestled against the Rocky Mountains, and Anna was his conscience, his joy, his music. She wrote songs that never made it to the radio but lived in their private moments. Melodies whispered against his shoulder at dawn, lyrics scribbled on napkins during dinner dates that stretched past midnight. But success has a price. While Richard built his empire of healing others, he was too busy to nurture what mattered most. When Anna mentioned children, he'd say, "Someday, when things settle down." When she asked him to join her at charity events, work always seemed more urgent. The night everything changed, Anna was driving alone to a children's hospital benefit. The same event Richard had canceled on at the last minute because of an important investor call. The roads were slick with early November snow. The truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel survived. Anna didn't. The funeral was a blur of corporate colleagues offering hollow condolences and relatives who barely knew her making speeches about her beautiful spirit. Richard stood there in his $3,000 suit, feeling like a fraud. Everyone spoke about Anna's music, but he realized with crushing clarity he'd never really listened. After the funeral, Richard walked through their home like a ghost. Her piano sat silent in the sunroom. Her song notebooks remained scattered on her desk, filled with half-finished dreams. The silence was unbearable, but worse was the music that played in his head, fragments of melodies he'd ignored, lyrics he'd never let her finish sharing. Within 3 months, Richard Cole, the man who'd spent his career helping others heal, resigned from his own company. He signed over his shares to his co-founder with a note that simply read, "I can't fix broken minds when I can't fix my own." He stopped answering calls. He ignored relatives who worried about his state of mind. The mansion felt like a mausoleum, so he did what broken men do when they can't face themselves. He ran. Richard threw a suitcase in his BMW and started driving with no destination. He drove through Idaho, Wyoming, back through Montana, searching for something he couldn't name. Maybe punishment, maybe numbness, maybe Anna's voice in the wind. But sometimes when we're running from ourselves, life forces us to stop. December in rural Montana is unforgiving. Richard had been driving for 2 weeks, sleeping in roadside motels, eating gas station food, and avoiding mirrors that showed him a man he didn't recognize. His beard had grown scraggly, his clothes hung loose from not eating, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd given up. The BMW began making a grinding noise around sunset, somewhere between Missoula and nowhere. Steam started rising from the hood. Richard pulled over on a lonely county road surrounded by snow-covered fields and skeletal trees that clawed at the darkening sky. He tried calling for roadside assistance, but his phone showed no signal. The temperature was dropping fast, and his breath came out in white puffs that reminded him of Anna's cigarette smoke during her rebellious college phase, a detail he'd forgotten until this moment of desperation. As darkness fell, Richard saw a dim light in the distance. Desperate and shivering, he abandoned his broken-down BMW and trudged through the snow toward what looked like an old farm. The light came from a weathered barn, its red paint faded to rust in places. Next to it, stood a modest farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney. Richard knocked on the farmhouse door, rehearsing what he'd say, but no one answered. Cold and exhausted, he approached the barn. The door creaked open to reveal hay bales, old farming equipment, and the sharp smell of animals and earth. It wasn't warm, but it blocked the wind. Richard had spent the last 20 years in boardrooms and luxury hotels. Now, he was preparing to sleep in a barn like some modern-day vagrant. He pulled hay around himself, trying to create insulation. The sounds of the night, wind whistling through gaps in the wood, mice scurrying, the distant call of an owl, seemed amplified in his urban ears. This was as far from his mansion as he could imagine. For the first time since Anna's funeral, Richard cried. Not the controlled tears of grief, but the raw, ugly sobs of a man who'd lost everything and realized he'd thrown it away long before death took it from him. He cried for the children they never had. He cried for the charity events he'd missed. He cried for every time he'd said, "Just 5 more minutes," when Anna wanted to share a new song. He cried until exhaustion finally pulled him into a fitful sleep on a bed of hay. But sometimes, our lowest moments become the doorway to something we never expected. Richard woke to the sound of an angel. That's what his sleep-fogged mind thought as consciousness slowly returned with the pale light of dawn filtering through the barn's gaps. A voice, clear and pure as mountain air, was singing somewhere nearby. A child's voice, but with a quality that seemed to carry the weight of old souls and ancient sorrows. The melody was hauntingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream. Richard sat up, hay falling from his wrinkled clothes, and listened with growing disbelief. Into the quiet light where shadows learn to dance, where broken hearts find second sight, and sorrow gets a second chance. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He knew this song. He knew every note, every pause, every breath. But that was impossible. This song had never been recorded, never been performed, never been shared with anyone outside their home. Into the quiet light was Anna's most personal creation, a lullaby she'd written for the children they'd never had, hummed to him on nights when insomnia kept them talking until dawn. She'd only played it for him 3 times, always saying it wasn't finished, always promising to complete it someday. Richard stumbled to the barn door and peered out. Sitting on a wooden fence post about 20 yards away was a little girl, maybe 10 years old, with braided blonde hair and a red winter coat. She was singing Anna's song while watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold. The girl sang with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the melody, swinging her legs gently as if she'd been doing this every morning for years. Her voice carried the same emotional depth that Anna's had, as if the song itself chose who could sing it properly. Richard approached slowly, afraid that speaking would shatter this impossible moment. But as his footsteps crunched in the snow, the girl opened her eyes, bright blue eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. "Good morning," she said simply, as if finding a disheveled stranger emerging from their barn was perfectly normal. "Did you sleep okay? Mama said someone was in there, but I told her you probably just needed a warm place." Richard's voice came out as a rasp. "That song. Where did you learn that song?" The girl tilted her head, studying him with the direct gaze that only children possess. "My mama sings it to me every night. She says it came from a very sad but very strong woman who wanted to help people find their way back to love." Richard felt the world shift beneath his feet. "What's your name?" "Lily." She smiled, and Richard's heart clenched because it was Anna's smile, wide and genuine and completely unguarded. "What's yours? Some encounters change everything." But Richard was about to discover that fate has a way of giving us exactly what we need, disguised as what we least expect. "I'm Richard," he managed to say, his voice still rough from sleep and surprise. "Richard Cole." Lily's eyes widened with recognition that seemed impossible for a child her age. "Mama," she called toward the farmhouse. "Mama, come quick, it's Anna's Richard." Before Richard could process what she'd said, the farmhouse door opened and a woman in her late 30s stepped onto the porch. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, flower-dusted hands, and the kind of genuine warmth that comes from people who've learned to find joy in simple things. When she saw Richard, her hand flew to her heart, and for a moment, she just stared. Then she walked toward them with purpose, her expression cycling through shock, recognition, and something that looked like compassion. "My God," she whispered as she got closer. "Richard Cole. Anna's Richard." She stopped a few feet away, studying his face with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "I'm Sophie Martinez. Anna and I were roommates at the University of Montana." The name clicked in Richard's memory. Anna had mentioned Sophie countless times. Her college roommate who'd become a teacher, who'd married young, who'd moved back to rural Montana to raise her daughter after her husband died in Afghanistan. Anna always said she wanted to visit Sophie but never found the time. "Sophie," Richard repeated, feeling like he was reassembling pieces of Anna's life that he'd never paid attention to. "Anna talked about you. She always meant to visit," Sophie finished gently. "I know. We stayed in touch through emails and Christmas cards. She sent me recordings sometimes, demo versions of songs she was working on." Richard looked between Sophie and Lily, understanding beginning to dawn. "The song? She sent it to me about 6 months before." Sophie's voice trailed off delicately. "She said she'd written it for the family you two were planning to start someday. When I played it for Lily, it became her favorite. She's been singing it every morning for 2 years." Lily had been listening to this adult conversation with the patience that children show when they sense something important is happening beyond their understanding. Now she looked up at Richard with those startling blue eyes. "Are you sad because Anna went to heaven?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. Richard felt his carefully constructed walls crumble. He knelt in the snow so he was at eye level with this remarkable little girl who carried his wife's song in her heart. "Yes," he said simply. "I miss her very much." Lily nodded solemnly. "Mama says missing someone means you loved them really, really much. And that love doesn't go away just because they can't hug you anymore." Sophie placed a gentle hand on Richard's shoulder. "You must be freezing and hungry. Why don't you come inside? Lily was just helping me make pancakes." Richard wanted to refuse, to retreat back to his safe cocoon of grief and self-punishment. But something about this place, these people, made running seem impossible. Maybe it was the way Lily slipped her small hand into his, or the way Sophie looked at him not with pity but with understanding. "Just for a little while," he said. The farmhouse kitchen was exactly what Richard expected, warm, lived in, filled with the smell of coffee and pancakes and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from actual living. Lily chattered as she helped her mother cook, occasionally humming fragments of Into the Quiet Light as naturally as breathing. Over breakfast, Sophie shared stories about her friendship with Anna that Richard had never heard. How Anna used to sneak into the music building at 2 a.m. to play piano. How she once wrote an entire song about the janitor who always left encouraging notes for stressed students. How she'd cried happy tears when Sophie called to tell her about Lily's birth, saying someday she hoped to have a daughter just as wonderful. "She never told me that," Richard said quietly. Sophie's expression was gentle but knowing. "Anna loved you desperately, Richard. But she also knew you were carrying the weight of everyone else's healing. Sometimes, I think she was afraid to add her dreams to your burden." The truth of that statement hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on building something meaningful, on helping others, that he'd made Anna feel like her dreams were burdens rather than gifts. Lily, who'd been coloring at the kitchen table while the adults talked, suddenly looked up. "Mr. Richard, do you want to see something special?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran to the living room and returned with an old acoustic guitar, worn but well cared for, with new strings that caught the morning light. "This was Anna's," Sophie explained. "She left it here after college and never came back for it. Lily's been learning to play." Lily climbed onto Richard's lap with the easy trust of a child who's never been given reason to fear adults. "Will you play Anna's song with me? Mama says you probably know it too." Richard's hands trembled as he took the guitar. He hadn't touched an instrument since Anna's death. But as his fingers found the familiar chords, muscle memory took over. The melody that had lived in their bedroom, in their quiet moments, in the dreams they'd never fulfilled, filled the kitchen. And then Lily sang. Her voice, pure and untrained but filled with the same emotional honesty that Anna possessed, transformed the song from a memory into something living. As they played together, this broken man and this innocent child, Richard felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but opening, like dawn after the longest night. Music has a way of reaching the places words cannot touch. And for Richard, this moment was about to unlock emotions he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. Over the following days, Richard found himself unable to leave, unwilling to return to the road that led nowhere, to the life that had lost all meaning. His BMW remained broken down on the county road, a problem he could easily solve with a phone call to his corporate account, with money that had once seemed important. But every morning brought a new reason to stay just one more day. Sophie never pressured him to talk about his grief or his plans or what came next. Instead, she offered simple human kindness, warm meals shared at a table where conversation mattered more than efficiency, practical tasks that required presence rather than productivity, and the understanding that sometimes healing requires nothing more than being seen without judgment or expectation. She told him about her own loss, her husband Jake, who died in Kandahar when Lily was 3, leaving Sophie to raise their daughter alone in a world that suddenly felt too dangerous and too empty. She spoke about the years of single motherhood, the challenge of keeping her own grief from overwhelming her daughter's need for stability, the way she'd learned to find meaning in small things. Lily's laughter, successful parent-teacher conferences, vegetables growing in their garden. Grief changes you, Sophie said one evening as they sat on the porch watching Lily build a snowman in the yard. But it doesn't have to destroy you. Sometimes it just teaches you what actually matters. Lily, however, had no such restraint about emotional boundaries or the careful way adults navigate loss. She attached herself to Richard with the fearless affection of a child who'd decided he belonged in her world, who'd made room for him in her heart without asking permission or considering consequences. She showed him her favorite hiding spots, around the farm, the loft in the barn where she went to think, the creek that ran behind their property where she collected smooth stones, the hill where wildflowers would grow in spring. She taught him the names of their chickens, each with distinct personalities and preferences, and insisted he join her for morning songs on the fence post where she'd first appeared to him like an angel, carrying his wife's voice. "Why do you always look so sad when we sing Anna's song?" she asked one morning, her breath visible in the cold air, her young face serious with the weight of a question she'd been considering for days. Richard considered giving her a simplified answer, the kind of careful explanation adults give children to protect them from complicated truths. But something about Lily's directness, her complete lack of pretense, demanded honesty. "Because it reminds me of all the things I should have done differently," he said, watching his own breath disappear into the Montana sky. "All the ways I failed someone I loved more than my own life." "Like what?" Lily asked, settling more comfortably on the fence post, clearly prepared for a real conversation rather than adult platitudes. "Like listening more. Like being home more. Like..." Richard's voice caught on words he'd never said aloud, truths he'd avoided even in his own mind. "Like saying yes when she wanted to have children. Like you." Lily processed this information with the seriousness that children reserve for adult confessions, for moments when grown-ups trust them with real feelings instead of careful explanations. "Do you think Anna would be mad at you?" she asked after a long moment of consideration. The question hit Richard unexpectedly, opening a door in his mind he'd kept carefully locked. He'd spent so much time angry at himself, so focused on his failures and regrets, that he'd never considered what Anna would actually feel about his self-destruction. She'd been frustrated with his work schedule, yes, disappointed by his priorities, certainly. But angry? Anna didn't carry anger. It wasn't in her nature to hold grudges or nurture resentment. No, Richard said slowly, the realization dawning like sunrise. I don't think she'd be mad. I think she'd be sad that I'm hurting myself like this. Anna always wanted me to be happy, even when I didn't know how to want that for myself. Then, maybe you should stop hurting yourself, Lily said with the simple logic that only children possess, the kind of wisdom that cuts through years of adult complications to reach obvious truths. That afternoon, while Lily was at school and Sophie was in town running errands, Richard found himself alone in the farmhouse for the first time since arriving. Instead of feeling anxious or lost, he felt curious. He wandered through the room slowly, noticing details that spoke of a life built on love rather than achievement. Hand-drawn pictures covering the refrigerator, books worn soft from multiple readings, quilts that had been mended rather than replaced. In the living room, he found Anna's guitar in its case, along with a small wooden box of items Sophie had saved from their college years. Inside were photographs that made Richard's chest ache with recognition and regret. Anna young and radiant, arm in arm with Sophie at various campus events, her face bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy he'd rarely seen in their later years. Together, there were handwritten letters full of college dreams and future plans, printed emails that chronicled the evolution of their friendship from roommates to lifelong confidants, and at the bottom, a CD marked in Anna's familiar handwriting. For Sophie, Demo Tracks 2022. Richard's hands shook as he put the CD into Sophie's old stereo system, technology that seemed ancient compared to the wireless speakers in his mansion, but somehow more honest, more real. Anna's voice filled the room. Not the polished recordings from their anniversary dinners or the careful performances she'd given for his business associates, but raw, honest versions of songs he'd never heard her sing. The first track was Into the Quiet Light, but hearing it in Anna's voice rather than Lily's brought a different kind of pain. This was Anna as she truly was, vulnerable, hopeful, writing about dreams that lived so deep in her heart she could only share them with her oldest friend, dreams she'd been afraid to share with her own husband because she knew how busy he was, how focused on more important things. The second track stopped him cold. It was titled, Someday When Things Settle Down, a gentle, heartbreaking song about waiting for a love that's always almost ready, always just around the corner, always postponed for the next achievement, the next milestone, the next someday, that never comes. The lyrics cut through Richard like surgical instruments, precise and devastating. He builds his towers, reaching for the sky, says he's doing good and I don't wonder why. But someday, when things settle down, he'll see the life we're missing now. Someday, when the work is done, he'll remember love is won by moments, not by monuments, by presence, not by promises, by choosing what's in front of you, instead of chasing what might be. Richard sank into Sophie's worn armchair and wept, not the desperate tears of the barn, not the angry tears of self-recrimination, but the deep, cleansing tears of a man finally understanding the full weight of what he'd lost and why he'd lost it. Anna had known. She'd known he was always waiting for someday, always believing that happiness was something to be earned rather than chosen, always thinking that love would wait patiently while he built his empire of good intentions. The third track was instrumental, a simple guitar melody that Richard recognized as something Anna used to play when she thought he wasn't listening, a song without words that somehow said everything about longing and hope, and the quiet space between what is and what could be. When Sophie returned home and found him there, surrounded by tissues and Anna's memories, she didn't ask questions or offer explanations. She simply made tea in her practical way and sat across from him, offering the gift of silent companionship. She loved you, Richard, Sophie said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Even when she was frustrated, even when she felt lonely, even when she wondered if you'd ever choose your life over your work, she never stopped loving you. She used to tell me that your work mattered, that you were healing people, that she understood why it consumed you. Richard looked up from his tea, eyes red from crying but clearer than they'd been in months. But she also said, Sophie paused, choosing her words carefully. She said she was afraid you'd forgotten that you were allowed to be happy, that you'd somehow convinced yourself that joy was selfish, that contentment was failure, that love was something to be earned rather than received. Take a moment to think about someone in your life who might be waiting for your someday. What would it mean to choose presence over promises? The conversation was interrupted by Lily bursting through the front door, cheeks red from cold and backpack sliding off her shoulder, her presence immediately changing the energy in the room from somber reflection to immediate joy. "Mr. Richard, you're still here." She launched herself into his arms with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely worried he might disappear, who'd spent the school day hoping he'd still be there when she got home. "I drew you a picture at school. Want to see?" The drawing was executed in the careful, intense style of a 10-year-old who'd put real thought into her work. 3 stick figures standing in front of a red barn. A tall man with dark hair, a woman with long brown hair, and a small girl with yellow braids. Above them, in careful child handwriting, she'd written, "My new family." Richard stared at the drawing, feeling something shift in his chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, he was allowed to have a life after Anna. Not a replacement life, not a betrayal of his grief, but a different kind of life. A life where love could take new forms without diminishing the old ones. Where family could be chosen as well as born. Where healing could happen in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the heart knows what it needs before the mind is ready to accept it. But for Richard, the real test was still coming. 2 weeks into his unplanned stay, Richard had settled into a routine that felt dangerously close to belonging, to the kind of everyday happiness he'd forgotten was possible. He helped Sophie with morning chores, learning the rhythm of farm life that followed seasons rather than stock prices. He drove Lily to school when the weather was bad, listening to her chatter about friends and teachers and the small dramas that make up a child's world. He spent evenings learning to play card games that Anna had never had patience for, games that required presence rather than strategy, attention rather than achievement. The broken BMW had been towed and repaired, sitting now in Sophie's driveway, like a reminder of the life he'd left behind, sleek, expensive, and somehow smaller than he remembered. His phone had dozens of missed calls from lawyers, accountants, board members, and the few relatives who'd noticed his disappearance. But Richard ignored them all, existing in this pocket of peace like a man afraid to wake from a good dream, afraid that acknowledging the outside world would make this fragile healing disappear. He helped Sophie plan meals that accommodated a growing child's preferences and a working mother's budget. He learned to appreciate the satisfaction of physical work, chopping wood, fixing a loose fence post, clearing snow from the driveway. Tasks that had immediate, visible results, unlike the abstract problems he'd spent years solving in boardrooms. Most importantly, he began to understand Lily's world, her school projects about Montana wildlife, her frustration with long division, her excitement about the spring musical where she'd auditioned for the lead role. He attended a parent-teacher conference with Sophie, feeling simultaneously like an imposter and like he belonged there, listening to Mrs. Henderson praise Lily's creativity and kindness. "She's been happier lately," the teacher observed, glancing between Sophie and Richard. "More confident. Having positive male influence seems to have really helped." The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late December. Lily had been practicing Into the Quiet Light on Anna's guitar, her small fingers becoming more confident with the chord changes, her voice growing stronger and more expressive each day. She'd asked Richard to play along, and they'd fallen into an easy harmony that filled the farmhouse with something that felt like joy, like the music Anna had always dreamed their home would hold. "You should record this," Sophie said from the kitchen doorway, where she'd been listening while washing dishes, her face soft with the kind of contentment that comes from seeing people you love find happiness together. "Lily's version is beautiful, and hearing you play Anna's music again, I think she'd love knowing her song is still alive, still bringing people together." The suggestion hit Richard like a betrayal, like someone had asked him to sell something sacred for public consumption. "No, that song was private. It was ours. Anna never wanted it shared with the world." Sophie's expression remained gentle but firm, the look of someone who'd known Anna in ways Richard was only beginning to understand. "Richard, Anna shared that song with me because she wanted it to live in the world. She said music isn't meant to be kept locked away like treasure. It's meant to be shared, to help people, to connect hearts that feel alone. You don't understand, Richard said, standing abruptly and setting the guitar aside with shaking hands. That song represents everything I failed to give her. Every dream I postponed because work was more important. Every child we never had because I was too busy, too focused on my career, stop. Lily's small voice cut through his rising panic with the authority that only children possess when they decide adults are being foolish. She was looking at him with an intensity that seemed far older than her 10 years, her blue eyes holding, a wisdom that seemed borrowed from somewhere beyond childhood. "Mr. Richard, can I ask you something really important?" Richard nodded, not trusting his voice, seeing something in Lily's expression that told him this wasn't going to be a simple question. If Anna was sitting right here next to us right now, what would you want to tell her? The question opened something in Richard's chest that he'd kept sealed shut for months, like a dam breaking under pressure that had been building since the night Anna died. Words poured out of him in a rush of grief and regret and love that had nowhere to go. Emotions that had been poisoning him with their silence. "I would tell her I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Sorry for every time I said 5 more minutes when she wanted to share a song. Sorry for canceling dinner dates because investors needed reassurance. Sorry for telling her we'd have children someday, when someday never came because there was always another milestone, another goal, another reason to wait." Richard's voice cracked completely, years of contained emotion finally finding release. "I would tell her that I was a coward, that I was so afraid of failing at being a father that I never tried, that I was so busy trying to fix everyone else's problems, so focused on being the CEO who had all the answers, that I couldn't see I was breaking the most important person in my life with my neglect." The words came faster now, like water through a burst pipe. "I would tell her that she deserved so much better than a husband who treated her dreams like interruptions to his important work. That she deserved children who would have inherited her music and her kindness. That she deserved a partner who understood that love isn't something you schedule between meetings. It's something you choose every day, every moment, every time you decide what matters most." Lily listened to all of this with the solemn attention of a child witnessing something sacred, something that adults usually hide from children but that she seemed old enough to understand. When Richard finished, his voice raw from confession, she climbed down from her chair and walked over to where he stood, tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Richard," she said, taking his hands in her small ones with the gentle authority of someone much older. "Do you know what I think Anna would say back to you?" Richard shook his head, unable to speak through the tears that felt like they'd been waiting months to fall. "I think she'd say that love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing each other even when you mess up, even when you're scared, even when you don't know how to do it right." Lily's voice was soft but certain, as if she was channeling wisdom from somewhere beyond her years. "And I think she'd say that if you really want to say sorry to her, you shouldn't say it to her ghost. You should say it by living the kind of life that would make her proud, by choosing love when it's scary, by being present for people who need you, by not wasting the time you have left being angry at yourself for time you already lost." The wisdom in Lily's words, wisdom that seemed to come from Anna herself channeled through this remarkable child, broke something open in Richard that had been frozen since the night Anna died. He sank to his knees so he was level with this 10-year-old who'd become his unlikely teacher, his unexpected healer. "Lily," he whispered, echoing the question she'd asked him weeks ago, but finally understanding what she'd been trying to teach him. "Have you ever loved someone so much that you weren't afraid of anything?" "Yes," she said simply, her small hand still holding his. "I love you like that, and Mama, and even Anna, even though I never met her except in her song. Love isn't about not being scared, Mr. Richard. It's about being scared and choosing love. Anyway, it's about deciding that being happy doesn't mean forgetting sad things. It means making room for both." Richard pulled Lily into a hug that felt like coming home, like finding something he'd lost so long ago he'd forgotten he was looking for it. For the first time since Anna's death, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost or what he'd failed to do. He was thinking about what he'd found. This child who sang his wife's songs with her own voice. This woman who'd offered him sanctuary without conditions. This family who'd chosen to love him before he'd learned to love himself again. "Lily," he said, his voice muffled against her hair, speaking words that felt like the most important he'd ever said. Would you let me be part of your family? Not instead of your daddy, because nobody could ever replace him. Not instead of Anna, because she'll always be part of me. But in addition to, as someone who loves you and your mama and wants to help take care of you." "I thought you already were part of our family," Lily said, pulling back to look at him with confusion. "Families aren't just about being born together, Mr. Richard. They're about choosing to stay together, and you keep choosing to stay." From the kitchen doorway, Sophie watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, seeing Richard transform from the broken man who'd emerged from their barn into someone learning to carry his love in a new way. Not letting go of Anna, but making room for new forms of love to exist alongside the grief that would always be part of him. Sometimes healing doesn't mean forgetting. Sometimes it means learning to love in ways we never imagined possible. That night, after Lily had gone to bed with the easy sleep of a child whose world feels secure, Richard sat at Sophie's kitchen table staring at his phone. The screen showed 17 missed calls from his former business partner, Elena, 12, from his lawyer about estate planning issues, and one that made his heart skip, a voicemail from Dr. Sarah Chen, the grief counselor Anna had been seeing before she died. He'd forgotten that Anna was in therapy. It was another detail he'd missed, while building his empire of helping others heal. Another sign of how little attention he'd paid to his wife's inner world. The irony cut deep. He'd created technology to help people process their emotions while remaining oblivious to the emotional needs of the person closest to him. With trembling fingers, Richard played the message, Dr. Chen's professional but warm voice filling the quiet kitchen. "Mr. Cole, this is Dr. Sarah Chen, Anna's therapist. I know this might seem unusual reaching out after all this time, but Anna left something with me before she passed. A letter she asked me to give to you if something ever happened to her. She was very specific about the timing. She said to wait until you were ready to hear her voice again, not as a ghost haunting your guilt, but as the woman who loved you. I've been checking in with mutual friends, and Sophie Martinez suggested now might be the right time. If you're ready, please call me." Richard stared at the phone, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Anna had left him a letter? How had he not known about this? What had she wanted to tell him that she couldn't say while she was alive? He looked toward the living room where Sophie was reading, then toward the stairs where Lily slept peacefully. These people had become his anchors, his teachers, his chosen family, but suddenly he needed to face Anna one more time, to hear whatever she'd wanted him to know, alone. Richard stepped outside into the cold night air and dialed Dr. Chen's number, his breath visible in small puffs as he waited for her to answer. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice was immediately warm and recognizing. "I'm so glad you called. I've been hoping you'd be ready for this. Would you like me to read the letter over the phone? Or would you prefer I email it to you?" "Read it, please," Richard said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "I need to hear it in a human voice." Of course, the letter is dated September 15th, about 2 months before Anna passed. She gave it to me during one of our sessions where we were discussing her feelings about your relationship, her fears about your future together. Here's what she wrote. "My dearest Richard, if Dr. Chen is reading this to you, it means I'm gone and you're finally ready to listen to me without trying to fix what I'm saying or solve the problem I'm presenting. I hope it also means you've stopped punishing yourself, because that was always your worst habit, turning love into a performance review, where you always gave yourself failing grades. I need you to know that I never doubted your love, not even on the days when you doubted it yourself. Yes, I wanted children. Yes, I wanted more of your time. But I also knew that your work was part of who you are, that your drive to help people heal came from the same place as your love for me, from a heart that couldn't stand to see suffering continue when it might be prevented. I fell in love with all of you, Richard, including the part that needed to save the world. My fear was never that you loved your work more than me. My fear was that you'd spend your entire life trying to be perfect instead of being present, trying to earn happiness instead of accepting it when it was offered. You thought I needed you to have all the answers, to be successful enough to deserve me, to achieve enough to justify taking time for joy. But all I ever needed was for you to show up as yourself, flawed, worried, imperfect human. The man I married wasn't the CEO or the successful entrepreneur. He was the person who cried during sad movies and brought me coffee in bed and listened to my terrible first drafts of songs like they were masterpieces. I wrote Into the Quiet Light for the children we might have someday. But really, I wrote it for you. For the child in you that forgot how to play, how to be silly, how to love without measuring the cost or calculating the return on investment. If something happens to me, Richard, promise me this. Don't let my death become another burden you carry, another failure on your endless list of ways you weren't enough. Let it be a door to the life we both wanted but were too scared to claim. You because you thought you hadn't earned it yet, me because I was afraid to ask for what I needed. Find someone to share my songs with. Let them live in the world. Let them help people the way your work helped people. Music and healing aren't so different. They both reach the places where words can't go. And please, please choose joy. Choose presence. Choose the messy, imperfect, beautiful life we kept putting off for someday. Someday is now, Richard. It was always now. I love you bigger than Montana sky, deeper than the roots of mountains, longer than forever. I always have. I always will. But don't love me so much that you forget to love yourself, to love life, to love whatever comes next. Anna. Richard stood in the snow, phone pressed to his ear, tears freezing on his cheeks as Anna's words washed over him like absolution. She had known. She'd known he'd blame himself, known he'd carry guilt like stones in his pockets, weighing him down until he forgot how to move forward. And somehow, even facing her own mortality, she'd tried to give him permission to live, to love again, to find joy without betraying her memory. Mr. Cole, are you there? Yes, Richard whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for waiting until I was ready, for knowing when that might be. After hanging up, Richard sat on Sophie's porch steps, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the rural darkness, clearer than any sky he'd seen from his corporate penthouse. Anna's words echoed in his mind. Let them live in the world. Choose joy. Someday is now. He thought about Lily's pure voice carrying Anna's melody to places Anna herself had never been. He thought about Sophie's gentle strength, her ability to create a home where healing was possible. He thought about the foundation he could build, not just with money, but with purpose, with presence, with the understanding that helping others heal meant first learning to heal yourself. Pulling out his phone again, Richard opened his camera app and walked to the fence post where Lily sang every morning. The same post where he'd first heard Anna's song in a child's voice and felt his frozen heart begin to crack. Tomorrow he would ask Lily if she wanted to record Into the Quiet Light. Not for fame or money, but for Anna's wish to share her music with the world. For the people who needed to hear that broken hearts could find second sight, that sorrow could get a second chance, that love could take new forms without forgetting old ones. But tonight, he would simply sit under these Montana stars and feel grateful for Anna's love that hadn't ended with her death, for Lily's wisdom that had taught him how to live again, for Sophie's kindness that had shown him family could be chosen as well as born, and for the possibility that tomorrow could be different from yesterday, that healing was not betrayal, that joy was not selfishness. Have you ever received a message that changed everything? Sometimes the words we need most come from the most unexpected places. Some gifts are meant to be shared, and sometimes sharing our deepest pain becomes the pathway to our greatest healing. The next morning, Richard found Lily at her usual spot on the fence, but instead of singing, she was sitting quietly, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Her small figure looked thoughtful, almost meditative, as if she was waiting for something important to happen. No song today? He asked, settling beside her on the fence, feeling the cold wood through his jeans but not minding it. I was waiting for you, she said simply, turning to look at him with those remarkable blue eyes. I had a dream about Anna. Last night. She was sitting right here on the fence with me and she told me that her song was ready to fly. Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air, a sense that something larger than coincidence was moving through their lives. What else did she say in your dream? She said music is like love. It gets bigger when you share it, not smaller. And she said to tell you that love songs are meant to be bridges, not boxes. Lily paused, considering her words carefully. She was really pretty, Mr. Richard. She had dark hair like Mama's, but longer, and she was wearing a white dress that moved like music when she walked. The description was so precise, so exactly like Anna, that Richard felt his breath catch. Whether it was a real visitation or a child's intuitive wisdom, channeling what needed to be said, the message was clear and undeniable. Lily, Richard said carefully, how would you feel about sharing Anna's song with other people? People who might need to hear it, who might be hurting the way I was hurting. Like making a recording for everyone to hear. Lily's face lit up, with excitement as if this was exactly what she'd been hoping he'd ask. Could we do it right here, where we always sing together? Where Anna visited me in my dream? That afternoon, Richard used his phone to capture something magical. The technology was simple. No professional equipment, no studio polish. But what they created was perfect in its honesty. Lily sat on the fence post backed by the vast Montana landscape singing Into the Quiet Light, while Richard played Anna's guitar. The video was unpolished, authentic, and absolutely beautiful. A child's pure voice carrying a song about hope to anyone who needed to hear it, with mountains and sky and winter light creating a backdrop that spoke of peace and possibility. But Richard didn't post it immediately. Instead, he spent the evening crafting something he'd never done before, a heartfelt explanation of the song's origin, Anna's story, and his own journey from grief to healing. He wrote with the honesty that Anna's letter had taught him, without trying to impress or succeed or achieve anything beyond simple truth. He wrote about a tech CEO who'd forgotten how to live while teaching others to heal. About a wife whose songs were too beautiful for boardrooms but too important not to share with the world. About a little girl whose voice became a bridge between loss and love, between yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's possibilities. This is Into the Quiet Light, he typed, his fingers moving with certainty for the first time in months. Written by Anna Cole for the children we never had, sung by Lily Martinez, a child who taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love even when it's scary, even when it's complicated, even when it means opening your heart to joy after devastating loss. Richard continued writing, the words flowing like water from a spring that had been blocked but was now running clear. Anna believed that music and healing serve the same purpose. They reach the places where words can't go. They connect hearts that feel isolated. They remind us that we're not alone in our struggles. All proceeds from this song will go toward establishing the Into the Quiet Light Foundation, supporting children who've lost parents, parents who've lost children, and anyone who needs to remember that love doesn't end when life changes. It just finds new ways to grow. Richard looked at the post for a long time before hitting publish, understanding that this was more than sharing a song. It was choosing vulnerability over safety, connection over isolation, Anna's dream over his fear of judgment or failure. Within hours, the video began to spread, not virally at first, but steadily, shared by people who recognized something true in Lily's voice, something healing in the song's message about second chances and quiet light. Comments poured in from viewers who'd lost spouses, children, parents, dreams, people who'd found in the simple video a reflection of their own journey from brokenness toward healing. A grief counselor in Portland shared it with her support group, writing, "This is what hope sounds like." A children's hospital in Denver began playing it in their family waiting room, where parents kept vigil over sick children. A military widow in Texas sent it to her teenage daughter with a message. "This little girl understands what Daddy would want us to remember, that love doesn't die, it just learns to live differently." But for Richard, the most important response came from Sophie, who found him on the porch that evening reading comments on his phone and marveling at the connections Anna's song was creating between strangers who shared the common experience of loss and the hope of healing. "Anna would be so proud," Sophie said, settling beside him with 2 cups of coffee, her voice soft with emotion. "Not just of the song being shared, but of you choosing to live again, to love again, to be present for what's right in front of you instead of always waiting for someday." Richard looked at this woman who'd given him sanctuary without questions, whose child had become his teacher, whose kitchen table had become his confessional and healing place. "Sophie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She nodded, her dark eyes steady and patient, waiting for whatever he needed to say. "Is there room in your life for someone like me? Not as a replacement for Lily's father, because nobody could ever replace Jake or what he meant to both of you. Not as someone trying to take Anna's place in my heart, because she'll always be part of who I am. But as someone who loves your family and wants to be part of it. As someone who's learned that love doesn't diminish when you share it, it grows." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the porch light, seeing not the successful CEO he'd once been, or the broken man who'd emerged from their barn, but the person he was becoming. Someone who'd learned to choose presence over achievement, connection over success, love over fear. "Richard," she said finally, her voice gentle but certain, "you've been part of our family since the day Lily decided you belonged here. The question isn't whether there's room. The question is whether you're ready to stop running from happiness because you think you don't deserve it." "I'm tired of running," Richard said quietly, taking her hand and feeling the simple miracle of human connection, of choosing to stay rather than searching for something else. "I'm tired of living like love is something that can be used up instead of something that grows when you share it. I'm ready to choose someday is now." Sometimes the most important journeys end not with grand gestures, but with simple choices to stay, to love, to be present for the life that's actually happening instead of the life we planned. 6 months later, Richard stood in the ballroom of the Bozeman Hotel, watching as 300 people gathered for the inaugural gala of the Into the Quiet Light Foundation. The event had sold out within a week of being announced, drawing attendees from across the country who'd been touched by Lily's video and the story behind it. Richard wore a simple black suit, not the $3,000 armor of his CEO days, but something comfortable and real. On his lapel was a small pin, a quarter note with wings, designed by Lily and manufactured by a local jewelry maker. His wedding ring still circled his finger, but now it felt less like a chain and more like a blessing. The foundation had raised over $2 million in its first 6 months, funding grief counseling for children, music therapy programs in hospitals, and support groups for parents navigating loss. Richard had discovered that his gift wasn't just building technology companies, it was building bridges between broken hearts and healing communities. Tonight's event would culminate with Lily performing Into the Quiet Light live, accompanied by a string quartet. It would be her first performance on a real stage, though she'd been singing for audiences since that first video went viral. As Richard watched the crowd, bereaved parents talking quietly with grief counselors, children who'd lost siblings comparing notes with social workers, couples rebuilding their lives after devastating loss, he felt something he'd forgotten was possible: purpose without obsession, meaning without consumption. "You look like you're exactly where you belong," Sophie said, appearing at his elbow. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented her dark hair, which she'd worn down for the occasion. Over the past months, their relationship had evolved from friendship to something deeper, not a replacement for what they'd lost, but something entirely new. "I feel like I'm exactly where I belong," Richard replied, taking her hand. "Thank you for helping me find my way here." "We helped each other," Sophie corrected gently. "That's what families do." The evening's program began with testimonials from families the foundation had helped. A father spoke about the music therapy that helped his son process his mother's death. A teenager shared how the foundation's support group taught her that grief and joy could coexist. A grandmother talked about finding purpose in volunteering after losing her grandson. But the most powerful moment came when Lily took the stage. She'd grown taller over the past months, but she still had the same bright eyes and fearless spirit that had first captivated Richard in that snowy barnyard. She wore a white dress that Sophie had sewn, with small musical notes embroidered around the hem, a detail that made Richard think of Anna and dream and love letters written in thread. "Hi everyone," Lily said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "I'm Lily Martinez, and I want to tell you about a song that changed my life. Actually, it changed all our lives." She talked about Anna with the easy confidence of a child who'd grown up hearing stories about someone she'd never met, but somehow knew intimately. She explained how the song had traveled from Anna's heart to Sophie's lullabies to her own morning serenades, and finally to the world. The song is called Into the Quiet Light, and it's about finding hope when everything feels dark, Lily said. "My friend Richard taught me that sometimes the saddest songs become the most healing ones, because sharing our pain helps other people feel less alone." As the string quartet began the opening notes, Richard felt tears he didn't try to hide. This was Anna's dream made manifest, her music living in the world, her love multiplied through the voices of people she'd never meet, but somehow touched. Lily sang with a maturity that seemed impossible for her age, but also with the pure joy of a child who'd never learned to be afraid of her own voice. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in the beauty of a song about second chances performed by a child who'd given so many people exactly that. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, but somehow reverent, the kind of response reserved for moments that touch the sacred places in human hearts. After the event, as cleanup crews worked around them and guests lingered over final conversations, Richard, Sophie, and Lily sat at a table near the stage, exhausted but exhilarated. "Anna would have loved this," Sophie said, watching volunteers carefully pack up the flowers that had decorated each table, flowers that would be delivered to local hospitals and nursing homes the next day. "She did love this," Richard said quietly. "I can feel her in every part of tonight, in Lily's voice, in the stories people shared, in the connections being made. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow." Lily, who'd been unusually quiet since her performance, suddenly looked up at Richard with serious eyes. "Mr. Richard, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. That day when you were so sad in our kitchen, when you were talking about Anna and saying sorry, do you still feel that way?" Richard considered the question carefully. "I still miss her every day, Lily. I still wish I'd done some things differently, but I don't feel sorry anymore because I think Anna can see what her love helped create. This foundation, our family, the healing that's happening because people heard her song. I think she'd say that love doesn't measure mistakes, it celebrates the good that comes from learning to love better." Lily nodded solemnly, then smiled with the brightness that had first captured Richard's heart. "Good, because I think she'd want you to be happy. And I think she'd want you to know that choosing us doesn't mean forgetting her." "How did you get so wise?" Richard asked, pulling her into a hug. "I had good teachers," Lily said simply. "Anna taught me the song. Mama taught me about love that makes room for more love. And you taught me that grown-ups can learn to choose joy even when they're scared." As they drove home through the Montana darkness, past fields that looked silver under the moon, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been a broken man sleeping in a barn, convinced he'd lost everything that mattered. Tonight, he was part of a family he'd never planned but couldn't imagine living without, running a foundation that carried his wife's love into the world, living a life that honored both his past and his future. The car was quiet except for Lily's soft humming in the back seat. Not Into the Quiet Light this time, but a new melody she'd been working on. Something about second chances and choosing family and love that grows instead of shrinks when you share it. Sometimes the smallest voice really does sing the loudest truth. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to listen, that truth leads us home. This story represents so many journeys of healing and hope. If it's touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear that their voice matters. Their pain can become purpose, and love always finds a way to grow. Subscribe for more stories about the healing power of human connection. And remember, you are never too broken to love again, and it's never too late to choose presence over promises.